My name is Greg Paulson, and for 14 years, I was the kind of employee every company claims they want, but very few actually deserve. I built the supply chain analytics infrastructure at Meridian Logistics from scratch, not upgraded it, not improved on someone else's foundation, built it from the ground up, starting with a whiteboard in a conference room that smelled like stale coffee and broken promises. When I walked in the door in 2009, Meridian was running their demand forecasting off spreadsheets that hadn't been meaningfully updated since the early 2000s. I'm not exaggerating when I say I found a tab in one of those Excel files labeled Y2K contingency. They had been hemorrhaging money on overstock for years, and nobody could figure out why. I figured out why. Within 8 months, I had a working predictive model that reduced overstock costs by 31%. By year 3, I had rebuilt the entire data pipeline, integrated it with our warehouse management system, and trained a team of 6 analysts to run it. By year 7, my forecasting methodology had been quietly adopted by 2 of Meridian's regional partners without anyone formally acknowledging where it came from. I noticed. I kept documentation. At the time, I thought I was just being organized. Turns out I was building a case without knowing I'd ever need one. The thing about working somewhere for a long time is that the company becomes part of your identity whether you want it to or not. I knew every quirk of the system. I knew why the Tuesday pull reports always ran slow, legacy join query that nobody had fixed because the guy who wrote it had retired in 2014 and everyone was afraid to touch it. I knew which vendors inflated lead times by 15% as a buffer and which ones were actually reliable. I knew the rhythm of the business the way you know your own neighborhood, instinctively without having to think about it. My boss at the time, a guy named Walt, used to say I was the only person at Meridian who understood the full picture. He wasn't wrong. He also advocated for me consistently, pushed for my title to be elevated twice, and made sure I had the budget I needed. Under Walt, I felt like my work mattered. Then Walt retired. And everything changed. The new VP of operations came from a private equity background. His name was Neil Strickland. He had an MBA from a school he mentioned within the first 10 minutes of meeting him. Good hair and exactly 0 experience running logistics operations. He had spent his career doing acquisition analysis and cost restructuring, which, in plain English, means figuring out where to cut. That was his skill. That was the lens through which he saw everything. I tried to give him a fair shot. I put together a comprehensive briefing on our data infrastructure, walked him through the forecasting model, explained how it had evolved over the years and what it was currently saving the company annually. I had the numbers. Concrete numbers. My model was directly responsible for an estimated $2.3 million in annual savings through reduced overstock and improved carrier negotiation timing. I didn't say that to brag. I said it because I thought it would matter to someone whose entire background was financial. He listened with this expression that I can only describe as politely absent, like his eyes were on me. But his mind was already somewhere else. After the briefing, he said, and I am quoting this as accurately as I can because I replayed it in my head so many times afterward. Interesting. But honestly, with what AI tools can do now, I'm not sure we need a whole team for this. The software has gotten pretty good. I kept my face neutral. I said something professional about complexity and institutional knowledge. He nodded and moved on. I told myself it was just ignorance, that he'd learned, that once he saw the system in action through a full demand cycle, he'd understand why you couldn't just swap in an off-the-shelf tool and call it done. I was wrong about that. Over the next 6 months, Neil systematically dismantled almost everything Walt had built in terms of team culture and investment. He cut 2 of my analysts. He froze the budget for a platform upgrade I had been planning for 2 years. He redirected our data reporting priorities toward a series of dashboards that looked impressive in PowerPoint but measured almost nothing operationally useful. He was optimizing for how things looked in quarterly reviews, not how things actually ran. And then came the conversation I should have seen coming from the moment he walked through the door. It was a Tuesday in March. He called me into his office. A corner office he had redecorated within 3 weeks of arriving, which told you everything you needed to know about his priorities. And told me he was restructuring the analytics function. My team would be reduced to 2 people. My role would be shifted from leading data strategy to a more execution-focused position. He used that phrase twice. Execution-focused. I asked what that meant practically. He said my new title would be Senior Analyst, no longer Director. I had been Director of Data Analytics for 6 years. I took a breath. I told him I appreciated the transparency and I'd like to understand the reasoning. I asked if this was a performance issue. He said no, absolutely not. I was a valuable contributor. But the company was moving toward a leaner model and the strategic function was going to be handled at the VP level going forward, meaning by him. I went home that night and sat at the kitchen table for a long time after my wife went to bed. I wasn't just angry. I was doing that particular kind of math that you do when you realize the ground has shifted under you and you need to figure out where you actually stand. 14 years. 6 figures, but barely. I had never pushed hard on salary because I believed in the work and trusted that the company valued me. I had turned down 2 outside offers in the past 4 years. Turned them down because I felt loyal. Because I thought that loyalty meant something. I thought about calling my brother-in-law, who had been telling me for years I was underpaid. I didn't call him. I already knew he was right. What I did instead was go into my home office and spend 3 hours going through every document I had ever created, every methodology, write-up, every model specification, every process design. And I started separating 2 piles. Pile 1, work I had created on company time, using company resources, in the scope of my employment. Pile 2, work I had created on my own time, using my own equipment, outside the scope of my job description, that I had contributed to the company voluntarily because I believed it would help. That second pile was larger than I expected. The forecasting model itself, the core algorithm, the logic architecture, the demand signal weighting system, I had originally developed over a series of weekends in 2011 and 2012 before I was officially given budget or scope to build anything. I brought it to Walt as a proposal. He had loved it and greenlit implementation. But the origin was mine, my personal laptop, my personal time, my own intellectual labor. I had also written the full methodology documentation, what I called internally the forecasting framework, as a separate document that I had always maintained as a standalone guide, not embedded in company systems. I'm not a lawyer, but I knew enough to know this warranted a conversation with one. I found an IP attorney through a referral from a friend who had gone through something similar at a tech company. I laid out the full history. I brought documentation, dated files, email chains showing Walt's responses to my original proposals, version histories showing creation dates on personal devices. The attorney took a week to review everything. Then she told me something that I had suspected but needed to hear confirmed. The core methodology, developed on personal time before any formal company assignment, had a legitimate claim to personal ownership. It wasn't airtight. Employment agreements and IP provisions are complicated, but it was real. She said if I decided to pursue it, we'd have a defensible position. I didn't do anything with that information immediately. I want to be clear about that. I wasn't sitting in my office plotting. I went back to work. I did my job. I trained my remaining team members as thoroughly as I could. I documented everything that would make the transition smoother for whoever came after me, because I'm not the kind of person who leaves a mess for the people who had nothing to do with the decision. But I quietly started to look around. A former colleague of mine, we had worked together at a smaller firm years before Meridian, had moved to a company called Arrowood Supply Partners. They were a mid-sized logistics and distribution firm, growing fast, exactly the kind of company that would benefit enormously from the kind of data infrastructure I knew how to build. She had reached out a couple of times over the years, nothing serious, just staying in touch. We had coffee occasionally at an industry conference. I texted her and said I was open to a conversation if she knew of anything interesting. She called me within an hour. The conversation with Arrowood's leadership team happened 3 weeks later. I went in and laid out in general terms my background, my approach to demand forecasting, and what I believed I could build for them. I was careful. I didn't bring proprietary Meridian materials. I talked about methodology in conceptual terms. But I knew what I knew, and the people at Arrowood were experienced enough to recognize capability when they saw it. They offered me a Director of Supply Chain Intelligence position at a salary that was 38% higher than what I was currently making. Full budget authority. A team of my choosing. Equity participation after 2 years. I went home and told my wife. She looked at me for a long moment and then said, "You should have done this 2 years ago." I gave my notice the following Monday. Neil seemed genuinely surprised. I don't know what he expected. He asked if there was a counteroffer that would change my mind. I told him no. It wasn't about compensation, which was mostly true. It was also about the fact that I had spent 14 years building something valuable, and the person now sitting above me didn't understand what it was or care to learn. I gave a full 4-week notice. I did comprehensive knowledge transfer. I documented every system, every process, every quirk. I trained both remaining analysts on everything I could cover in that time frame. I did this not for Meridian and not for Neil. I did it because my colleagues on that team had nothing to do with any of this, and they deserved a fair shot. On my last day, a few people from the team took me to lunch. My analyst, James, who had been with me for 5 years, said something I still think about. He said, "You know this whole thing falls apart without you, right?" I told him I hoped not, and I meant it. What happened at Meridian over the following months, I learned mostly secondhand, through James and through a couple of other colleagues I stayed in touch with. The first thing was the forecasting model. Neil had assumed, apparently, that because the model lived in Meridian systems, it was Meridian's to operate independently. What he had not understood, because he had never bothered to understand it, was the degree to which the model's accuracy depended on manual calibration, judgment calls that weren't written into any process document, and the institutional knowledge of how to interpret its outputs. The 2 remaining analysts were competent. They were not trained to make the higher-order decisions. The model started producing outputs that looked reasonable but were wrong in ways that weren't immediately obvious. By early fall, Meridian had over-ordered on 3 major product categories and was sitting on inventory they couldn't move. The cost was significant. Neil brought in a consulting firm to assess the analytics function. The consulting firm, from what James described, basically told him he had gutted a system that had been working well and replaced it with a skeleton crew and unrealistic expectations. The second thing was the IP question. I had retained my attorney and, on her advice, sent a formal letter to Meridian outlining my ownership claim on the forecasting framework methodology document. I wasn't demanding anything at that point. The letter was establishing a record. It put Meridian in a position where they had to either dispute the claim or acknowledge it. They disputed it. Their legal team sent back a standard work-for-hire response. My attorney had anticipated this. We filed for a declaratory judgment. I want to be honest here, the legal process was slow and expensive and stressful in ways I hadn't fully prepared for. My wife was patient, but there were nights when she'd ask how much longer and I didn't have a good answer. It was not a clean, satisfying experience. It was grinding and uncertain, and it took a toll. But the documentation held up. The dated file histories, the emails showing the pre-assignment origin of the work, the fact that the core methodology predated any formal company scope by 8 months. 14 months after I filed, we reached a settlement. The terms are confidential, so I can't share specifics. What I can say is that it was enough to matter. And that Meridian's legal team, in the final negotiation, dropped their work-for-hire argument entirely. Meanwhile, at Arrowood, I had been building. This was the part that didn't make headlines and didn't have a dramatic moment. It was just work, which is what I had always loved. I spent my first 6 months at Arrowood doing exactly what I had done at Meridian in 2009, sitting with the existing data, listening to the operations team, understanding where the pain was. I built a new model from scratch. New architecture, better than anything I had built before, informed by everything I'd learned. By the end of my first full year, Arrowood's forecast accuracy on core SKUs had improved by 44%. We renegotiated 3 major carrier contracts off the back of the data. The operations team started calling me with questions I had never been asked at Meridian. Not, "Can you pull this report?" but, "What do you think we should do about this?" That meant something to me. The other thing that happened was that James left Meridian. He called me about 7 months after I had joined Arrowood and asked if we had any openings. I told him honestly what we had. It wasn't a perfect fit for his current experience level, but we had a role that could grow into what he wanted. He took it. He's been one of the best hires I've made. A few months after James, my other analyst, a young woman named Claire who had joined my team 2 years before I left, also reached out. She had been patient, Waited to see how things developed at Meridian. She told me she had given it a fair chance and it wasn't improving. I found a role for her too. I didn't go looking for these people. They found me because people know when they've worked somewhere functional and when they haven't. I heard through the network that Neil was eventually let go about 18 months after I left. Not specifically because of the analytics situation, but that was part of a broader pattern of decisions that hadn't landed well. The company brought in someone new who, from what I understand, immediately identified restoring the data function as a priority. I don't feel triumphant about Neil losing his job. I'm being honest. I thought about how I'd feel about that, and I don't. What I feel is that it was a predictable outcome. You can only make consequential decisions based on things you don't understand for so long before the results catch up with you. He made a lot of decisions at Meridian that were confidently wrong. His replacement is probably still untangling them. Here is what I think about when I look back on those 14 years. I think about the version of myself who turned down those outside offers, who decided that loyalty and investment and doing good work would be recognized and rewarded. I'm not entirely sure that person was wrong, actually. I learned a lot at Meridian. I built something real. The skills I have, the professional reputation I have, the fact that Arrowood trusted me with budget and autonomy from day one. All of that came from the foundation I built over 14 years. But I also think about the fact that I waited too long, that I let my sense of belonging to an institution override my own judgment about what I was worth, that I let Walt's advocacy become a substitute for advocating for myself. When Walt left, I should have reassessed immediately. I should have gone back to market, gotten the sense of what the outside world valued my work at, and either used that information to renegotiate at Meridian or used it to leave. Instead, I waited until someone else made the decision for me, just in a different direction than I expected. If I'm talking to someone who's reading this or watching this and recognizing themselves in any part of it, someone who's been somewhere a long time, who is genuinely good at what they do, who has maybe been passed over or had their contribution minimized or watched someone less capable get handed authority they hadn't earned. Here is the most useful thing I can tell you. Document your work. Know what you created and when. Keep records. Not because you're planning to fight anyone, I wasn't, but because when the moment comes, and it may come, you will be grateful you were organized. Know your worth before someone else tries to define it for you. The market has an opinion about your value. That opinion doesn't care about your loyalty or your tenure. In some ways, that's cold. In other ways, it's clarifying. Go find out what the number actually is. And when someone above you looks at something you built and dismisses it because they don't understand it, that's information. That's important information. Take it seriously and act accordingly. The industry awards that have come since. I keep them in my office at Arrowood, a couple of plaques on the shelf that, I'll be honest, I barely look at. What I look at is the dashboard we run every morning, the one that tells me how accurately we predicted demand the day before, the one that a whole team of people helped build and uses every single day to make real decisions. That's the thing. Not the revenge, not the settlement as satisfying as that was in its own quiet way. The thing is building something that works, with people who understand what it is. I was given a chance to do that again. I didn't waste it. I've had a lot of time to sit with all of this, and the thing I keep coming back to isn't Neil. It isn't the settlement, or the moment I signed the offer letter at Arrowood, or even the phone call where my attorney told me we had won. The thing I keep coming back to is Walt's retirement party. I remember standing in the back of that conference room with a plastic cup of grocery store champagne, watching Walt shake hands and hug people, and thinking, this place is going to be fine. Walt, build something solid here. The foundation holds. I was so sure of that. I was wrong. And the reason I was wrong is worth being honest about. The foundation I was so confident in wasn't Meridian's. It was Walt's. And when Walt walked out that door, I should have understood immediately that I was no longer operating in the same environment I had spent 14 years building trust inside. I didn't. I kept showing up the same way, with the same loyalty, the same patience, the same willingness to wait for recognition, because I had confused a relationship with an institution. That's the first thing I tell anyone who sees themselves in this story. The company is not the people who believed in you. When those people leave, reassess. Not cynically, just clearly. The second thing is about what Neil actually did to me, because I don't think it was personal, and that's important. Neil wasn't cruel. He was incurious. He had made up his mind about the value of data work before he ever walked through the door, and no briefing, no number, no 14-year track record was going to move that needle, because he wasn't actually looking at the evidence. He was looking for confirmation of a cost-cutting thesis he had already written. People like Neil aren't malicious. They're just expensive to work for, and you find that out slowly, one decision at a time, until one day you're sitting at your kitchen table doing math that doesn't add up. The intellectual discipline I'm most grateful for, looking back, is documentation. Not because I knew I'd need it. I didn't. I documented because I was organized and because I took my work seriously. But those dated files, those email chains, that version history, they became the factual record of my contribution when the narrative around me was being rewritten by someone who hadn't been there. Your work tells a story. Make sure it's written down somewhere that can't be edited by someone else. And here's the hardest part. The part about resilience that nobody talks about honestly. Leaving Meridian was the right decision. The settlement was fair. Arrowood has been everything I needed it to be. And there were still nights in the middle of all of it, during the legal process, during the uncertainty, when I genuinely wasn't sure it had been worth it. Perseverance doesn't feel like strength when you're in the middle of it. It just feels like not quitting. The resolve to keep going when the outcome isn't guaranteed yet. That's the real test. And it's quieter and less dramatic than anyone tells you. James and Claire are both at Arrowood now. They found their way there because they're good at what they do and because they recognize the difference between a functional environment and a broken one. I didn't recruit them. People know. They always know. And eventually they act on what they know. The forecasting dashboard runs every morning. The team built it together. It works. That's what I wanted. It just took longer to find the right place to build it.